Now that we optimized our little demo application here, let me dive into that functional component versus stateful component or container component again. So basically components defined with class, which extend component, which is one way of creating a component in React, and components which are just functions, as all other components in this application are. Now, as I mentioned a lot in this course, you should try to create functional components as often as possible. Why? Because these components have a narrow focus and a clear responsibility. They are only about presenting something. They are about rendering JSX, and they contain some logic to display this JSX correctly. For example, by adding some CSS classes as we do here in the cockpit component. They don't do much else, and one thing they definitely don't do and they can't do is manage state. And I mentioned a lot that the reason why we have this separation is that we want to have a few places in our application where the application state does change. This makes sure your application stays maintainable even as it grows. Because the more your application grows, the harder it becomes to manage state. Because if you manage state in every single component, it is super hard to track where you edited this list of persons, where you created this new post. If you get a few containers where you do that, and where you then simply pass state and handlers down via props, this is much easier to handle because you can always see in the end, the state gets changed here in the app.js file, and we distribute references to the functions which edit it via props. But all the other components are not able to change state. This is one of the core foundations of a good React application. Use the class-based components as little as possible, but of course don't be afraid of using them if it makes sense. If you get a central point in your application, and a good split typically are multiple features, so for example if you have a blog feature and an authentication feature in your app, then the root components of these features might very well be containers which manage the state for that feature area. And you will see this in action throughout this course when we dive into the bigger course project. But all our components, as mentioned often, should be functional components. I'll also dive into one important difference besides the existence of state and the availability of methods which you have in class-based components. I'll dive into one other important difference between class components and functional components in the next lectures, and that would be the lifecycle of a component. Before diving into the lifecycle, let's compare stateless and stateful components again. Just to bring this back into mind, stateful components, also referred to as containers, and stateless components differ by the fact that stateful components are created with the class keyword and extend component, whereas stateless components are just functions which receive props. Now, important differences are of course the access to state and, this is new, the existence of lifecycle hooks. In stateful containers, we can access state and we can implement lifecycle hooks. I'll come back to what that is in the next lecture. Stateless components neither have access to the state, nor can they implement lifecycle hooks. And if we want to access state and props, in stateful containers, we do this via the this keyword. This state xy, this props xy. And in stateless components, we do this with just props xy. We receive props as an argument. And as mentioned often, only use stateful components if you need to manage state or access lifecycle hooks. Use stateless components in all other cases. And just because we never did it, I want to highlight this props xy thing in stateful components. If we consider our only stateful component we have here, it doesn't even use props. It only uses state. But it would have access to props too. And I can demonstrate this to you. Let me pass some props right from the index.js file. Let me pass a title prop here, which can just be a string where I will say relevant persons. Now this can be the title of our application. In app.js, which is a container, we can still access props. It's not like it doesn't have access to props. Here, we want to maybe pass this on to the cockpit to display it there. So let's define a new title there, a new property there, maybe app title, to not confuse it with the prop we're about to pass on. And now we know that there is this title property available in our app component because we set it here in the index.js file. Now, of course, we can't access it like this. We can't access props title because props would be an undefined variable here. We're inside a render method, and inside this method we never define props, and this method also doesn't receive props as an argument. So props is undefined here. But the class itself has a props property because we extend component. And just as we have access to a setState method, which we never defined ourselves, we also have access to a props property we never defined ourselves. It's given to us and populated by React. And we can therefore access this props like this. And in this case, we simply pass it on, but of course we could also output it here in this template. But since we pass it on, I'll now go to the cockpit and handle this brand new property, maybe here, to output it here, props app title. In here, again, just using props, because we do receive props as an element here, with one curly brace though. Props is just the argument we receive for this function passed into it automatically by React. If we save all files now and go back to our application, you see relevant persons as the new title we're seeing here, because now we're setting this in the index.js file and we pass it down. And as you can see, we got props in our container too. We didn't use it before because we never received something before. But if you want to use props here, use it with this props just as you use this state, because you're in a class here, you're not in a function, you're not receiving props and state as arguments here.